Are you considering whether or not you should buy a RODECaster Pro or a RODECaster Duo? In this video, I'm going to share my thoughts and experience after I was sort of forced to use a RODECaster Duo for the past month. I'll tell you what I like about it, what I don't, and who I think would be best served with a RODECaster and who I think could save their money and go with something cheaper. But first, let's go into a little backstory about me and how I was forced to use the RODECaster. My primary audio interface is a Universal Audio Apollo X8, but one day it just kind of died on me, and I was forced into using something else as a replacement. I picked up the RODECaster Duo sometime last year, I think during Black Friday, but I haven't really used it, so I figured this was a good time to get some hands-on experience with it. This also, I guess, coincided with my switch to the Shure SM7B. If this is the ubiquitous podcaster, live streamer, content creator setup, I better have some experience with it since my clients are asking about it. That's how I ended up using the RODECaster Duo for a month. It was more or less out of necessity, and during that time I recorded a number of videos and did a few live streams to really get a feel for it. So let's start with the pros and cons. On the pro side, it's got good preamps with 76 dB of gain, so you don't need a mic booster if you're using something like an SM7B. It has plenty of gain even for someone like me with a quiet voice, though it does get a little bit noisy at higher gain levels, but I think that that's the noise floor of the mic and not the preamps themselves, because I got a similar amount of noise when using a FET head in this setup. I made a video about the myth of mic boosters and how they add noise, and I'll link to it in the description up here, or maybe up here in one of the corners, and that way if you'd like to see it, you can click on it. I'll also include it in the description. Another pro is the physical faders and controls. They're just good for immediate volume adjustments. The sound pads are good if you're someone who likes to use sounds during your podcast or live streams. But it's just nice having all of those controls right there at your fingertips. Another pro is the virtual devices, which they, I guess, rolled out a few months ago, which allow you to create custom routings for apps on your computer. And one of the things that kind of took me by surprise was just how nice it is to have a physical mute button. On the cons side, the virtual devices that I just mentioned as a pro, the con is that as a Mac user, I need to use loopback in order to send the audio from most, I guess, everyday type programs into those virtual devices. Another con is the headphone amp doesn't play well with low sensitivity headphones. This requires a $10 device to get rid of the noise, and to me, that's unacceptable in a product that costs this much. The menu system, for me, I don't find it very intuitive. And that brings us to the end of the pros and cons section. And I'm going to pause things here for just a second and ask that if you're enjoying the video, that you take a second to give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel to see more of my content. But now, let's talk about the menu system for a minute. I mentioned it in the cons, and I've seen others comment about the RODECaster being difficult to set up, especially for those that don't have an audio background. I never really paid attention to those comments because I hadn't used one and I do have an audio background. But now I have to say that this isn't really a matter of not having an audio background. It's more of an issue with the user interface combined with documentation, which to me, I don't find to be the greatest. I don't like that there isn't an actual PDF manual. Instead, we get a series of web pages, which I found to be more convoluted to navigate and find the specific information I needed. And if I did find something and I had to go back to look at it, it was a challenge trying to find where that specific piece of information lived because there's so many web pages there. But let's go back to the menu. Almost everything seems to be at least 2 taps away, sometimes even more, because it seems like everything is nested in a submenu within a submenu. And compared to the RODECaster Duo, the Mackie DLZ Creator XS, which I'm testing out right now, it's kind of the closest competitor to the Duo. It's much easier to navigate. But having said that, once you get everything set up right, you should be able to do most of what you need from the home screen on the Duo or the RODECaster Pro 2. Another thing that can be a little confusing to new users is that it has 2 USB connectors, and each one has different uses. One is your primary connection to your computer. That's the USB 1. Then you have USB 2, which it can be used to connect hard drives or other devices or even a second computer. And when you're using USB 1, you'll see 2 audio interfaces show up in your list on your computer. You'll see RODECaster Main and RODECaster Chat. They recommend using Chat when you're using it with streaming apps or video calls because it's configured to do what you need to avoid the other people on the call from hearing themselves echoed back to themselves. The RODECaster Main device, though, that's where you get access to the multi-track and virtual device functions. Moving on, let's talk about the headphones. The first issue I ran into was that I plugged in the headphones and there was a lot of noise. Even with the volume set to its minimum and no audio playing, the headphones were noisy. And what you need to know is that this is a known issue when using low sensitivity headphones. But the good news is there is a $10 fix for this if it ends up being an issue you're facing. Not all headphones are going to have this issue, but if you do, it is easy enough to fix. And I'll link to my video about that in the description and up here in the corner up here. But the next thing I encountered when using the headphones was latency. And if you're unfamiliar with latency, what that means is that there's a delay between when you speak and when you hear it in your headphones. This won't be an issue if you're not using headphones, but if you are, it's very distracting because what you hear in your head as you speak and through your ears, it isn't synchronized with what you hear through your headphones. And the only fix I've found for that was to bypass the processing on the Duo. Since I wasn't planning to use any of the inbuilt processing, this really wasn't an issue for me. And I'd recommend testing things out to see if the basics like EQ and compression add any latency or not, because that's something I didn't really go into test because I was able to just turn it all off and get rid of the latency. I do all of my editing anyway, so I didn't want the EQ and compression from the RODECaster being baked into my audio. But just know, it's not all bad with the RODECaster. I really liked having the faders and the physical mute buttons. My Apollo, it doesn't have faders, and it's not easy to change levels on the fly, There's no real controls on the panel for easy adjustment. I have to do all kinds of things to make an adjustment unless it's to my headphone volume or my main output, or the gain to whatever mic or preamp is selected at the moment. So having an easy way to mute my mic without using a mouse click on the software controller, that's really nice. The only drawback to the mute button is that it doesn't work when you have the RODECaster set to multi-track mode and pre-fader. While I prefer to work in pre-fader mode, it's not the end of the world to use it post-fader. It just means that we need to be a little more careful when recording or streaming to ensure that we don't accidentally bump a fader. The faders, though, they do provide nice real-time control over all of the most common adjustments one might need to make while recording or live streaming. And an extra bonus, at least for me, is that since the RODECasters transmit MIDI, I can use the faders on the Duo to control the volumes of the different channels on my Apollo interface. The RODECaster devices, they do address one of the main objections people have with interfaces, which is the lack of physical control. Rode addressed these objections and they packaged it into a distinctive, brightly colored box. And this is a really great example of branding and knowing how to solve a pain point that their customers are having. So let's get down to my recommendations with the RODECasters. I feel that the RODECasters are primarily geared towards, maybe not geared towards, but best used by people who are recording in-person interviews. The Duo is good for those who are recording two-person, in-person interviews. And the big brother for those, the RODECaster Pro 2, is good for those doing 3 to 4 person interviews. In terms of live streamers, the Duo could be an attractive option if you have an in-person co-host, or if you do solo streams and you really benefit from having the sound pads. If this is you or your situation, I encourage you to also check out the Mackie DLZ line. They are very comparable, but in what I've seen so far, the DLZs do offer a few things that the RODECaster doesn't, like it has a de-esser. And for someone like me, that is a really nice touch. And the other thing is I didn't detect any latency when using the included EQ and de-essing. But for everybody else, I feel like you're paying for the reputation of the RODECaster and a bunch of features that you're not going to be using. So if you're a podcaster doing remote interviews or a solo show, the Duo is probably going to be overkill. If you're a streamer who doesn't stream with an in-person co-host, or you don't need the sound pads, it's overkill. I mean, you could even use a Stream Deck to play sound effects, so you don't really need a RODECaster. And I hear a lot of people talk about getting a RODECaster and an SM7B to improve the quality of their audio. But the thing to keep in mind is this equipment, this pairing, it really has very little impact on the overall quality of your recordings. For instance, the RODECaster Duo is $500. An SM7B, that's what, another $400? So that's $900 for recording one channel of audio using what is essentially high-end consumer-grade gear. You could easily get an MV7 for $350 and invest the rest into nice acoustic panels from somewhere like GIK Acoustics, and that would have a much bigger improvement in your audio than spending $900 on a Duo and an SM7B. And that improvement would mean that you can use any mic, and the audio that you record will require a lot less effort to clean up. But if you already have an XLR mic, you're not really getting a noticeable improvement in audio quality by upgrading to a RODECaster Duo or a RODECaster Pro, especially when you compare that to something like a Focusrite Vocaster 2 or a Mo 2 M4. I'd be willing to go so far as to say that you and your audience would hear no difference in the quality of your delivered episodes. At this point, you're just simply paying for sound pads, faders, and a pretty box. But I want you to know that you shouldn't feel like you need a RODECaster or a Shure SM7B to be a real podcaster or to have good quality audio. Keep in mind that people aren't tuning into your content because of the equipment that you use. But what about you? Do you use a RODECaster? How do you like it? What do you wish you knew about before buying it? Would you buy it again? Let me know in the comments. And thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.